Christians need to realize that that is exactly what life looks like for us as believers. That we are literally living in a bombed-out war zone. And we can see the casualties of war strewn everywhere we go. We see marriages that are absolutely crumbling and falling apart. We see lives that are being destroyed by addiction. We see people living in greed and abandoning everything that is right and good and wholesome for the sake of the next dollar that they can bring in. And we look at these things, and then we look even beyond that, and we see people doing absolutely evil things. Right? You don't look at them and go, that's just not right. No, we watch the news and we go, that's evil. It's not just bad, it's evil. I've often wondered this. I haven't hung out with a lot of schizophrenic people, but Toby, my friend Toby, pastor over at Doosan, he has hung out with a lot of people. And I asked him this question one time. I said, why is it that schizophrenic people never have, nice imaginary friends? Right? They're always trying to kill them or asking them to hurt themselves or do something like that, right? Their imaginary friends are never pink fairies that tell them to eat ice cream. That's not one of their normal things. There's something that's there that's just plain outright evil. And you and I may have been in, I know I have been in many places where I have been in the presence of people, or sometimes I've been in places where there was nobody around, but there was just a firm sense of evil that was there. That's because we live in a war zone. And ultimately, we live in the epic battle for the souls of men. And we, as God's sons and daughters that have been adopted as His very own, we live in this epic. So we ask the question, what makes a great epic? When we watch these movies, we watch these things, we watch these big battles, what makes a great epic? And I think if we ask that question, look at this passage of Scripture, and apply it to our lives, we're going to see that God has set out some stuff that we desperately need. The first thing that we see there, to have a good epic, is we need an enemy. Right? You don't have a great epic battle scene in a movie when an army shows up and there's nobody there to fight. Right? That's just called camping with swords. There's no warfare that goes on there. We need an enemy. Scripture tells us who our enemy is. Our enemy is a guy by the name of Satan, Lucifer. Now, it's an interesting thing about him. Satan shows up in a number of places throughout Scripture. He is one of the chief creations of God. Understand this, Satan is not an equal with God. Satan is not there's God here and Satan here, that they are equals. One is the yin and one is the yang, that they are opposite. That's not the case. Satan was a created being of God. He was created for good purposes and decided to rebel against God in that fashion. Paul says here, finally be strong in the Lord, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. It's important to know who our enemy is. Because if you don't know who your enemy is, you don't know how to fight them. If our army today was to say, okay, we are going to engage in Afghanistan in a combat strategy situation, fighting against Native Americans. You go, why would you do that? They go, we don't know. It just sounds like it's a good idea for us to do that. Right? We have war strategies that we had from the 1700s of how we did that, so we're gonna do that. And you go, but that's not who your enemy is. And they go, why is that important? You say, because these guys are not going to fight the same as those guys did. You want to know who your enemy is so that you can know how they fight and what their plans are. And it's an interesting thing if you study anything about war history. Every time we go into a war situation, they look very closely at the way that people group fights and responds to combat. The way that we fought the Germans in World War II was very different than the way that we fought the Japanese in World War II. Because they both had a very different view of the value of their own life. The Japanese said it was honorable to die. The Marines said it was honorable not to back down. That was a bad combination for us to throw those two guys together. Because neither one of them would back down, and it was a bloody fight. The Taliban insurgents that we're fighting today have a very low view of the value of human life in general. And so they'll simply strap a bomb to themselves, walk into a crowded square, and blow themselves up. And because we know that, we know how to fight them, we figure out how we do combat differently to engage that person. Satan is exactly the same way. And this is the thing we need to understand, is that we're not unaware of Satan's schemes. We know how Satan fights. We have watched him fight throughout the pages of Scripture and throughout the course of human history. We know how Satan fights. We know his schemes. As he says here, he says that we are to be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might, putting on the armor of God that we can stand against the schemes of the devil. Satan comes at her. He has three combat strategies. His schemes include lies. That's his first thing. They're lies. Satan. This was Satan's first strategy against mankind. He came to Eve and he just started in casual chit-chat conversation, and then ultimately his bold-faced move was he lied. He just lied. He said, what was it God told you? And Eve told him, he said, well, God said that we should not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, nor should we touch it. And Satan looked at her and he said, or you shall surely die. That was the end of it. And Satan looked at her and he lied and he said, you shall not surely die. That was just simply a lie. Satan is called the father of lies, and we as Christians need to understand that that is the chief way that Satan fights. He lies. Now, with that in mind, have you ever wondered why Scripture puts in such a high demand of justice against lying? In fact, in Revelation 21:8, there's this list of things like murder and sorcery and all of these sexual sins and all of these things that we would look at and say, those are heinous sins. And then at the very end of it, it says, and all liars. The reason that God hates lying so much is it's the chief tool of Satan. Lying is the native tongue of Satan. It's his chief dialect. And he does a great job at it. When we encounter lies, we need to realize that that is the chief tactic that Satan uses against us. Secondly, Satan is described as the accuser. So accusations are his next thing. We as Christians know this very well, that there's been times when we knew what was right to do. We knew that we needed to confront somebody about some kind of sin situation, or we needed to stand up in the gap and being what God called us to be, doing what God called us to do. And there's this thing that comes in the back of our mind and says, well, you can't say anything about that because look what you did when you were a teenager. Or you can't tell, this is the parent thing, you can't tell your kids not to do that because you did it. It's this accusation thing that's thrown out against us. They accuses us of stuff. There's times that Satan accuses us of things that we honestly didn't do. He just lies to us in an accusation form. But there's also times where Satan comes to us with things that we have